Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the Greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
Janet Applefield is a very familiar face because she's been a member of Lifetime Learning for a number of years. We're lucky that she has agreed to share her time and experiences with us as a child survivor of the Holocaust. She survived because someone responded to her cries as an abandoned child. She survived because someone responded to her cries as an abandoned child. And Janice tells us they did not care who I was or what religious background I came from. Their motive was pure and simple: to save a child. My rescuers are the genuine heroes. They asked for nothing and gave everything. For years, survivor Janet Applefield has told her powerful story and imparted her wisdom to facing history and ourselves, students, teachers, staff, and community members. She's touched the lives of so many people, and for that we are deeply thankful. Janet's story shows us the role of the bystander in her own life. This is a strong message for us to think about as we deal with issues today. Janet's strength as a very young child is so moving, and it sets such a model of perseverance. And this is, I'm just so delighted to read the next sentence. I wish she would write a story for young adults because she provides such a strong model. And guess what? She has, and I hope she'll tell us a little bit about it today because it's such an important message. Janet's a clinical social worker specialist in Sharon, and she graduated with honors from BU of Medicine in 1981. So you want to hear her, not me. So welcome, Janet.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I did not graduate from BU in School of Medicine, School of Social Work. But so I'm really pleased to be here. I speak to thousands of students every year, students and adults every year, with the hope that it will promote greater awareness and understanding of the dangers of hatred and prejudice. And it's my hope that each and every one of us will stand up to any kind of injustice. I'll be showing you some slides. Yes. It's very unusual for a survivor to have photos, so I'm very fortunate to have these. These were saved by one of my grandfathers and one uncle. I speak about the Holocaust because it was one of the most vicious and heinous crimes in the history of mankind. As a result of World War II, between 50 million and 60 million people were killed. Of that number, 6 million Jews were murdered because the Nazis had a particular hatred against Jews, and they were determined to destroy all Jews of Europe. 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered. Only 11% survived, and I was one of those very lucky children. I was born in Krakow, Poland, and I lived with my mother, father, baby sister in a little town 50 miles south of the city of Krakow. I lived there with a large extended family, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I was the first grandchild in the family, so needless to say, I was pampered, I was spoiled. By the way, my birth name was not Janet. My birth name was Gustava, and throughout my childhood, my name was changed 3 different times. Also, my appearance had a lot to do with my survival because I looked like a typical Aryan child. I was blonde, light skin, certain shaped nose, and so I fit that profile. I have warm memories of the first few years of my life. I had an uncle who had a motorcycle with a little sidecar. He used to put me in there, take me for rides, take me to the candy store. I remember cooking and baking with my mother and my grandmother, preparing for holidays. Well, this wonderful, idyllic life ended abruptly September 1st, 1939, when Germany attacked Poland. I was just 4 years old when the war started. My father told me he was awakened 5 o'clock in the morning. He heard explosions. He turned on the radio, and he heard the announcer say that Poland was attacked. So the first few days of the war were very confusing. People didn't know what to do, where to go. My father took me and my mother and my baby sister to my other grandparents' home nearby in another town. When we arrived there, everybody was packing up their belongings and running away, trying to escape. They were going in the direction of Russia. My grandfather packed some of our belongings onto a horse and wagon, and we started this journey. I remember that ride because there were planes overhead shooting at us. We had to jump off the wagon, hide in a ditch, and wait till the shooting stopped. I remember seeing an airplane that was shot down and it burned and crashed. Sometimes the roads and bridges would be out. We had to cross the river by foot. And after several weeks of such very difficult travel, we arrived at our destination. In the meantime, my father and my uncles tried to join the Polish army to fight the Germans. But Poland was defeated in 1 month's time. And when that happened, my father, my uncles, joined the caravan of people that was constantly streaming out of Poland and heading to Russia. There were approximately 200,000 Polish nationals that crossed the border into Russia. Life in Russia, first of all, when my father first arrived, he had no idea where we were. Communication in those days was difficult. Not too many people had phones. Certainly there were no cell phones. So my father advertised in the newspaper looking for us, and in time he was able to find us. Life in Russia was extremely difficult. There was shortage of food. There was shortage of work. One time, there was an announcement made that any able-bodied men who needed work should report at the town hall. And they were told to bring shovels and hoes. And so my two uncles went. My father didn't go that day because he wasn't feeling well. When they arrived at the town hall, there was a marching band playing. They were made to sing nationalistic songs. And then they were marched to a local ravine. They were told to take off their clothes, and they were shot into the ravine. So my two uncles died in that way. I remember a very tragic thing happening. My baby sister got very sick. She contracted diphtheria. So of course there was no medical treatment, and my baby sister died. She was just 18 months old. I also remember my mother getting very sick, running high fever. In those days when people had temperature, they used to use leeches. They put the leeches behind my mother's ears, and the leeches sucked the blood, and that reduced the fever. And my mother did get better. The other thing that they used to do when someone had fever, they used to put these, what's called cupping. Some of you might be familiar with cupping. So there were these cups that they swab the inside of these cups with alcohol, then put a match to it, and then they put these cups on a person's back, and that they adhered to the skin, and that too was supposed to reduce fever. In any case, my mother did get better. And then there was an order issued that all these people that had come to Russia, in order to be allowed to stay and work, had to take out Russian citizenship. The family was divided. They didn't know what to do. My parents were afraid to do that. Their thinking was that if they did that, they couldn't go back home and get their property back. So they decided to return to Poland. My grandparents and one aunt and uncle stayed. The people who stayed were put onto trains and sent off to Siberia, where they were sent for slave labor. And my grandmother died there. My grandfather survived. When we arrived back in our town, at first my father was arrested because they said he was a communist because we came from Russia. I remember cooking and baking with my mother every day, bringing my father his food. And in time, my father was released. The other thing I remember was one time, the Gestapo, the secret police, came to our apartment. They made everybody undress. They were looking for valuables, money, jewelry, furs, anything of value they took. All the Jews were forced to live in a ghetto, and all the Jews were forced to wear armbands to identify themselves as Jews. My parents decided that we would try to escape. So one night, well, before I tell you this, I forgot something else. Every day there were roundups of people. Some people were sent to labor camps. Others were taken to the local cemetery and shot. Every day there were hangings in the town square. My parents thought that we might be able to escape. So one night, we left the ghetto and we went to the train station. Train stations were very dangerous places because often the plainclothes Gestapo would be hanging out. But we managed to take a train and we ended up in another town where my mother had relatives living. When we arrived there, it was a very similar situation because the Nazis were so very well organized. My parents thought we could try to escape one more time. My father got a horse and wagon. It was August 1942. It was a very bright night when we started to drive out of town. We didn't get very far when suddenly in the distance we noticed Polish police approaching. We jumped off the wagon and we started to run. Now you might wonder, why would we be afraid of the Polish police? And the reason for that was that Poland was a very anti-Semitic country. And so we were scared. So we started to run, and often Polish police would cooperate and collaborate with the Nazis. So we started to run, and we ended up in some fields where potato plants were growing. We tried to hide, but potato plants are very short, so in no time they found us, they beat us up, and they made us return. And at that point, my parents realized that there was no place to run, no place to hide, nowhere to escape. They were desperately trying to find someone who would be willing to take me and hide me. They were able to convince a woman, her name was Maria. Maria was a nanny to one of my cousins. They begged Maria to take me, and she agreed. So one day, my parents sat me down and explained that I was going to go with Maria, that I should be good, I should listen, and that we would be reunited very soon. So I left with Maria. In the meantime, there was another order issued, and it was that all the people from this town and all the surrounding towns had 3 days to report at an area outside of Krakow called Wieliczka. My parents made one more decision. They decided to separate from each other. Their thinking was that if they separated, maybe, just maybe, one of them would survive. So they got to this place independently, and when they arrived, there were about 12,000 people congregated in a big meadow. It was August 1942. It was very hot. There was no water, there was no food, and there was no place for them to sleep. So they had to sleep outside. And then there was a selection. A selection meant that there was a group of SS officers who selected who would live and who would die. Approximately 1,000 men were selected for slave labor. The rest of the people, my father was one of those men, the rest of the people were put into 53 boxcars marked with the letter B. Each boxcar, the floor of each boxcar was sprinkled with a white disinfectant. Between 120 and 150 people were put into each boxcar. It was so crowded that they couldn't sit or lie down. They had to stand for 5 days. And they were sent to the concentration camp called Belzec. When they arrived, some of the people were already dead because they inhaled the fumes from the disinfectant. The rest were taken off the train, and they were taken to the gas chamber, and they were gassed. It took only 3 hours from the time they arrived to when they were killed. Only 2 people survived this camp. This camp existed only 6 months. In that period of time, 600,000 people were murdered. My mother was one of the victims, so was my grandmother, my cousins, aunts, uncles, many of my relatives. Now, my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. Every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, he and other prisoners were marched to a local cable factory. My father worked on an assembly line, making electrical cables. He told me he kept a little photograph of me in front of him. He said that's the only reason he wanted to live, knowing that he gave me away and he had to find me when the war would be over. While my father was still living in the ghetto, the Nazis were building the concentration camp called Płaszów on the outskirts of the city of Krakow. And by the way, the camp where my mother was killed, Belzec, that camp was destroyed. And when the Nazis learned how to kill more efficiently, they opened Auschwitz, and they burned this camp to the ground. Today, there's just a monument standing in that place. So when the camp Płaszów was completed, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated, and everybody was sent to the concentration camp. Now, I left with Maria. Maria had an apartment in the city, and I remember so well being in that apartment because there would be times when she would go out in the evening and leave me alone. She'd lock the door, and I'd be in this pitch black apartment because there was no electricity. And I was really scared. I'd be crying. I was trying to unlock the door. Of course, I couldn't, and I was on the second floor. One day, there was a sharp knock on the door. Maria opened the door. There was an SS officer standing there, and he said, "I have orders to search your apartment to see if you're hiding any Jews." He barged in. He looked under all the furniture. He turned some of the furniture over, and he came to me, held up my braid. He wanted to know who I was. Maria told him that I was her niece, that she was taking care of me because her sister was sick. He looked at me with his chilling blue eyes, and he turned around and he left. And to this day, I remember what he looked like. He was blonde, he had blue eyes, and he was wearing black leather boots that came up to his knees. I could hear the clicking of his heels as he went down the steps. My father knew that he had to make different arrangements for me because Maria said she could not keep me indefinitely. He was able to contact a cousin who was living on falsified Polish papers. She had Polish identity. So one day, I was brought to the ghetto fence and my care was transferred from Maria to my cousin. My cousin was able to obtain a birth certificate from a Catholic priest of a little Polish Catholic girl who died. Her name was Krystyna Antoszkiewicz, and I became her. I took on her identity, so I had a new name, and I had a new nickname. My nickname was Krisha. My cousin was young. She was just 19 years old, very confident, very brazen. There would be times when she would take the trolley in the city, and she would always tell me to be quiet, not to speak, not to say a word, because Polish people were forbidden to sit in front of the trolley. They had to sit in the back. The front was reserved for Germans. But because my cousin spoke German fluently and I didn't, we would sit in the front, and of course, we got away with it. We lived in another little town outside of the city of Krakow. She was very, very mean to me. She used to beat me with a fireplace poker. And when I cried for my mother, she would say, "Your mother is dead. She's never coming for you." She used to go out for the whole day, leave me outside, lock the door. I'd be sitting on the front stoop, cold and hungry. There was a nice lady next door. Her name was Janina. I remember when my fingers were so badly injured, Janina made bandages for all my fingers, and all my nails turned black. They got infected, and all my nails fell off. But Janina was nice. Sometimes she would give me a piece of bread if I was hungry, and sometimes she would let me play with her baby. One day, my cousin said she was going to meet her boyfriend in the city, and she took me with her. When we arrived in the city, she took me into a church, and she told me to sit and wait for her while she was going across the street to meet her boyfriend in a cafe. So I sat and I waited for her, and I waited and waited, but she never came back for me. So finally, I walked out of the church. It was late afternoon. I looked across the street. The whole street was cordoned off. I crossed the street. There were little groups of people standing, and I overheard them say that the Gestapo had come and they arrested everybody in that cafe. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street crying. I didn't know what to do, where to go. And suddenly a woman came up to me and said, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" She quickly put me under her cape, and I said, "Could you please take me to the bus? I was going to go back to my village." And she said, "No, you're too little." So she took me into the building, the apartment building, the same building where the cafe was, but upstairs to the apartment of a woman by the name of Alicia Gohom. Alicia asked me, "What happened? Who are you? Where are you from?" I had a story that I practiced to tell in case I was ever captured. And so I told her that I was the daughter of a Polish officer, and both of my parents were killed in a bombing raid, and my cousin was taking care of me, and now she was gone. Alicia said I could stay, but actually I couldn't stay in that apartment for 3 reasons. One was that Alicia's mother was very active in the Polish resistance, and in her apartment she ran a hospital, she had shortwave radios, and she had ammunition. Another reason was that there was an SS officer living in the building. And the third reason was that when the Gestapo made an arrest, they always returned. So they were afraid to keep me there. So that early evening, the oldest son took me, and we walked for several miles, and we came to a farm came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church, and Alicia's brother-in-law was the administrator of that farm. So I remained on the farm. I remember one time we had slaughtered a pig, and they were cutting up the carcass in the kitchen. Now, Polish people were forbidden to kill animals for their own consumption. That was strictly reserved for Germans. But they had just killed the pig. They were cutting up the carcass. The kitchen was a big mess. And suddenly there was a knock on the door. Someone came to tell us that the Gestapo was on the way. It was not unusual for them to come. They would stop every once in a while to pick up cheese, butter, eggs. So very quickly, we cleaned everything up, we hid everything in the attic, and we waited. And they came. And when they came, I was really scared. I was always afraid of uniforms. Whenever I saw a uniform, I was scared. I don't know what made me do this, but I said, give them vodka. So they pulled out the vodka, they were drinking, and then I started to sing and dance, and they were laughing at me and drinking and amused, and finally they left. My father told me of an incident that happened to him in the concentration camp. One night, in the middle of the night, he had to use the bathroom outside. He found a cigarette stub, and he was smoking. A guard saw him and shot him in the face. The bullet lodged under my father's cheekbone and just stopped right there. Of course, he couldn't get any medical treatment, so that bullet had to remain there. When the Nazis realized that they're losing the war, they wanted to destroy any evidence. So they had all the prisoners in the camp where my father was dig up the very shallow graves around this camp. There were thousands of bodies buried in shallow graves. So my father's job was to dig up the bodies, put them in a big pile, and burn them. So he told me he couldn't get the smell out of his nostrils. He could smell the burning flesh and bones for years. When that job was completed, the Germans burned the camp to the ground. Today there's just a monument standing there. And the rest of the prisoners were sent to other concentration camps. My father ended up in 3 different camps. We were liberated by the Russians, and I remember that well because we too had to use the outhouse. And so and they were fighting all around the farm. So when we went outside, we were risking our lives. So when the war ended, my cousin's father found where I was, and he came to get me. I didn't want to go with him because I was afraid of him, just the way I was afraid of his daughter. But of course, the family didn't feel like they had a right to keep me, so I left with him. He didn't keep me very long. He turned me over to a refugee center in Krakow. So you can imagine that the survivors coming out of camps or out of hiding, they were sick, they had no money, they had no clothes, they didn't know if their relatives were dead or alive. So the refugee center was a place where they could get some help. So I was about 10 years old when the war ended, and I went to live in the refugee center. There were about 70 children like myself. Not that many boys, because in those days only Jewish male babies were circumcised. So that was a mark of difference. So there were a couple boys in the room that were wearing dresses to disguise their identity. Every day there were lists posted on the wall with names of survivors. And along came a woman, her name was Lena Kuchler. She came every day looking at the list, searching for her family. And she came across this room full of children and made a decision that she had to open orphanages for the children. So I remember the night we left for the orphanage. We had to leave in the middle of the night because there were men and women picketing in front of the refugee center carrying hateful slogans saying that Hitler should have killed all of us. We climbed into the trucks. There were 2 trucks. They pulled tarpaulin covers over us so that we wouldn't be seen. One truck was for children who had tuberculosis and other serious diseases. Polish hospitals would not accept Jewish children, so they had to open a separate orphanage for those sick children. So I went to live in an orphanage. Only the high school age kids were sent to high school, to the public high school, but every day they came back, they were beaten up by the Polish children. Lena went to the school pleading with the school to protect the children, but they didn't. Lena was always afraid that our home would be attacked because the other orphanage was attacked 3 different times. And finally it was decided that it was too dangerous to keep it open. So they closed that orphanage, and those children came to live with us. Because Lena was so afraid that our home would be attacked, she obtained ammunition, and the older children were trained in use of ammunition. And sure enough, one night, a Polish lady knocked on the door. She came to tell us that our home was going to be attacked. So the children took their positions on the roof and on the balcony, and they waited. And in the middle of the night, Polish men came. We were alerted by a Polish lady. She came to tell us that. And the Polish men came. They were on horseback, they were carrying fire torches, and they were shooting. But the children were able to defend the home. One day, Lena went back to Krakow to pick up some provisions, and she overheard a man asking about his child. She said to him, "Can you describe what your daughter looks like?" And when he did, she said, "I think I have your daughter." She came back to the orphanage, and she called me down to her office and said, "I have wonderful news to tell you. Your father has survived." I will always remember the reunion with my dad, because when I first saw him, I was so scared of him. He looked like a skeleton. He was so sick, and he was hugging me, and he was telling me he's going to take me away. I said, I didn't want to go, because for the first time, I had friends, and Lena was our mother. We called her mother. My father was so sick, he really couldn't take me right away, so he rented a room nearby. He got stronger, and he gained weight, and he took me. And we went back to our town, and we lived with few of my father's friends who survived above my grandparents' store. And but we weren't safe there. There were notes posted on the front door saying we would be killed. Several of my father's friends were murdered after the war. Young men driving in a car, they were ambushed and shot. So my father was really scared that we would be killed. He went to the police chief asking for protection, and the police chief said all he could do is to give my father a gun. So he slept with a gun under his pillow, and it became very clear that we had to leave our town. So we left, and we moved to Krakow, which was a little safer. So in time, my father realized that we had no future in Poland. We weren't welcome, or we couldn't get our property back. It was very unsafe, and so he decided we had to leave. He had 2 brothers. One was in Palestine, and the other one was in the United States. And he asked me where I wanted to go. And I said, I want to go to America, because I heard that money grew on trees. So, of course, it wasn't a simple matter as packing up our bags and leaving. It took about 2 years for us to get the proper documents. We had distant relatives living in New Jersey who sent us these documents that basically stated that if my father couldn't support himself and support me, that They would take care of us so that we would never become a burden to this country and have to go on public assistance. So in March of 1947, we sailed on a marine transport boat. It was a very rough crossing because the Atlantic is very stormy in March. Everybody was seasick. All the girls and women slept on one deck, and all the boys and men slept on a different deck. I remember being enchanted with vending machines. I loved putting in a nickel and getting a Milky Way. In those days, Milky Ways were really good size. And the other food I loved was Jell-O, red Jell-O. I had never seen that before. So we settled in New Jersey. I was almost 12 when I came. So my uncle took me to school, to grammar school. I had never been to school. I knew how to read and write in Polish, but I didn't speak English. So he took me to an elementary school, and there in the school office he said, what name do you want? You have to have an American name. So that question really caught me by surprise. I hadn't thought about it before. And I came up with the name Jeanette because we had a cousin who lived in Paris, France, and she used to visit in the summertime. She was very beautiful and glamorous, and she had long red nails, and that did it for me. So I said Jeanette, and my uncle said, no, in English it's Janet. So that's how I became Janet. So I was put in a 5th, 6th grade, combination grade, in April, but by June I was promoted to 7th grade, which was the correct grade for me. We had another serious situation. We came on a 90-day visitor's visa. In 90 days, we had another visa to go to Venezuela. The only way we could remain in this country is if my father married an American citizen. So the family looked around and they found him a wife. So in that short period of time, I had a new stepmother, new name, new language, new appearance because they cut my hair, new friends, everything was new. I remember my 8th grade teacher always referring to me as that little foreign girl. Here I was trying to blend in, fit in, not stand out, but that's how she identified me. But I was very fortunate because I had a wonderful group of girlfriends who kind of took me under their wing and helped me out, socialized me. So then, of course, I went on to high school, and I was a good student. I was quite active. I was in student band. I wrote for the paper. I was in student government, French club. So I was active. And then off I went to college. But at age 19, I got married. So some of you may identify with this because in those days, girls married very young. And so I got married, but I promised my parents that I would finish college. So I kept my promise. I carried a baby to class. It was very difficult. When I speak to kids, I say, I don't recommend it. It's too young to get married. So, so today, I finished college, and then later on, a few years later, I continued my education, and I got my master's degree. So today, I'm a social worker. I still work part-time. I have 3 children, and I have 5 grandchildren. And I know that when I'm no longer here, that my legacy will continue because my children and grandchildren will continue to tell my story. Because I think the story is an important one, and that should live on. And I've often thought about the people who saved me, because they were the true heroes. They did something that was dangerous, but they still made the decision to save a child. So it has made me realize how important choices and decisions are, and to be mindful of the kinds of choices and decisions that we all make. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer.
when you have a question, is there anyone that has a question? If you will stand.
Testing.
Yeah.
Just a little closer. So if you could stand, please, and wait till a mic comes to you before you ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your story. Thank you for your story. My question is, how would you describe the attitude of the Polish people towards the Jewish people?
Today?
No, when
Then?
you were a child.
Today, too. Well, I think there were times when there would be outbreaks of anti-Semitism in our town. Basically, the Jewish people kept to themselves. They had their own organizations and clubs, but it was fairly cordial. They interacted pretty well together, but it was sort of separate. But I know that there was discrimination in terms of colleges, like Jews couldn't enter certain professions, couldn't go to school. And today Poland has a very conservative government, and there is tremendous upsurge of anti-Semitism.
Here you go.
Thank you. I was just wondering if, as you grew older, if you ever had a chance to go back and visit with some of the people that had helped you along the way, and just go back to
Right.
where you had been.
So I've been back to Poland four times. Each time I've met with my Polish family, and each trip has been a little different for me. At first, it was very difficult. I was determined that this wasn't a vacation. I wasn't going to have a nice time. But as time has gone on, I've felt a little differently. But I keep in close contact with my Polish family, and I have spoken at the church where I was abandoned. I've spoken in my father's high school, at the Jewish museums, and in a cafe in my town. And the people were very, very interested in what I had to say. And I also showed the PowerPoint, and one older lady said, "I remember you. I remember your mother. She was so beautiful." And then a man came up, and he used to work in my grandfather's store. So it's been interesting. And in 2012, I was contacted by a young Polish woman. She was writing her thesis on the Holocaust, and she became very interested in my family, and her dissertation has a big chunk about my family, and so she's done so much research. That's why I know some of the very small details about what happened to my family. I know what happened to my grandmother, and my grandfather was recognized on the street by someone. He was reported to the Gestapo. He was arrested, and they attached him to a horse-drawn cart, and they dragged him through the streets, and that's how he died. One of my uncles hid in an attic, and someone denounced him, and he was arrested and shot. So this woman has done a huge amount of research on my family, and that's how I know exactly how my mother died. Prior to this research that this woman has done, I didn't know how she died. I thought she died in Auschwitz, but she did not. She died in this other concentration camp.
Growing up, I noticed my family never spoke of the Holocaust. Is that very common, have you found, or not?
Yes. First of all, our survivors did not start to speak about their experiences till 70s, after that first TV movie was made about the Holocaust. So they couldn't speak about it, and people here couldn't hear the horrible atrocities. Today, there's still some survivors who cannot speak about it. But of course, over the years, people have been able to speak about it.
What have the Facing History students that you speak to, how have they reacted, and what are some of their questions?
So I speak to so many students, and I'm very touched by the fact that they're very moved by my story, and they ask very good questions. They want to know how my experiences have affected me and my family, and they're very, very thoughtful with their questions.
Would you share more about your book?
Oh, well, the book is coming. It's not it's not quite here, but so over the years I've been writing, and my hope for the book is that each chapter of my story is going to be introduced by maybe one page of historical content, so that each story is set into a historical content. And the Polish woman, Karolina, is going to be doing the writing, because she's the historian, and she knows all about my family. And my hope is that if and when it's published, that it might be adapted in schools, because I think it would be very appropriate for their curriculum in schools.
Well, I think there's so many strong messages in your story, but as a small child, you had such determination and willingness, and I wondered if you could just spend a little time talking about what you see as your strengths as you went through this.
I've thought about that question, and I decided that what had helped me so much throughout those years was having had a very strong foundation, strong family ties, lots of love and nourishment. So I think, and the memories of my family, those were the things that sustained me during the war.
I was wondering if, as a young person, getting over the Holocaust was easier than for the older people. I mean, some of the questions have been asked, you've lent some light on that. I remember being amazed that the writer, Stefan Zweig, and his wife, who fled after the Holocaust, wound up committing suicide because they couldn't readjust to their life outside of Austria, and whether you pondered people doing that kind of thing or just falling apart.
I think each survivor handled the situation in very different ways. There's so many variables that go into this. I know survivors who cannot speak about their experience to this day. So my father suffered terribly. He had terrible nightmares. I would be awake in the middle of the night listening to him screams. So I don't know. I mean, each person handles it differently.
How do you feel about the rise of anti-Semitism today in Trump world? And I'm finding it extremely upsetting.
I agree with you. It's very disappointing and upsetting. that I think for that reason, we all have to stand up to any kind of injustice or in our individual ways try to do something about it. Are you saying how?
How?
How? That's a big question. I don't know, joining groups that are doing things, or writing letters to your congressman or senator, or
But it's just a general atmosphere.
oh, it's terrible. Yeah, it is.
First of all, thank you for telling us this. I think it's important that we hear from you what it was actually like, rather than just reading it in a book. You are the living proof of survival, and I think that's a testament to you. And my question really was, are you part of any kind of association, or is there any kind of group that other Holocaust survivors, such as yourself, can belong to, or do you not keep in touch with anybody else, or just...
Yes. So there is Facing History and Ourselves is a educational foundation that provides a curriculum to schools about how to teach about genocide, Holocaust being one of the genocides. So I'm part of that, and I keep in touch with some of the survivors. One of the people that I was in the orphanage with is local here in Massachusetts. I keep in touch with her.
Well, I had the chance to work with Facing History as a teacher, and it was such a powerful course. And the theme of Facing History is the role of a bystander in society. And of course, the focus was on what was happening in Nazi Germany. And one of the lessons that we worked on with our children was, when we hear something going on, you just don't step back from it. You take the opportunity to make the comment. And you need to do some pre-thinking about the kind of thing that you would say if you heard someone saying a prejudiced remark. And so we worked on some of those things in class so that kids became better about not being a bystander anymore.
So, Janet, thank you very much. Having known you for now 30 years as a mother to my good friend Debbie, I've always seen you as a person of peace and giving. And I was curious how you've processed this in your life to get to that point. And what's your message for all of us about being emissaries of goodness and hope and generosity when troubles come?
Well, I was very fortunate to have had a father who didn't believe in general responsibilities. He thought there were good Germans and bad Germans, and that he accepted people on the basis of their character and what they did. And so he was my role model, and I accepted that same thinking. So basically, I just followed his example.
Well, this was a very good way to end it, and thank you for your remark. This was a very moving session, and we thank you so much for sharing your time with us and experiences.
Thank you so much for having me.